and getting me, I get to write another title. It's probably the funnest part of it, is the writing. Other part of writing is not so fun. I like to write titles. But I want to say a little bit about sort of why I chose the title and what today's talk is going to be. My biggest project that I've been working on the last couple of years has been on migrant seafarers, and so on Filipino seafarers. But I've started 2 new projects that I sort of want to connect today to sort of my project on seafarers. And that is to look at the rise of business process outsourcing, mainly call centers in the Philippines. And then the other is the recruitment of teachers, secondary teachers and public school teachers right here in Los Angeles, in Compton, and Inglewood, and a couple places, and nationwide. And so those are 2 projects that are just starting out, and I'm just trying to think about it, but I want to sort of use this rubric of thinking about sort of global labor niches and national niches through the sort of looking at race and racialization. So that's what I want to focus on. So most of it will be focusing on the seafarers with hopefully an idea of sort of how I might look at the other 2 projects. So I'm not really presenting much data from the other 2 projects. We'll mainly focus on the seafarers. As a lot of you might know, the Philippines is one of the largest sort of labor-sending states. About 8.2 million Filipinos live outside the Philippines. It's about 10% of the population, almost 20% of the labor force is resides outside the country. About 3.5 million are permanent migrants. About 3.8 million are sort of temporary migrants on contracts, and another million or so, even more, are sort of undocumented. TNT, most of them come as overstayers. So TNT is tago ng tago, right? They're in hiding that come into various places, but mainly in the U.S. So overall, Philippines is sending about 3,000 people per day out of the Philippines. Okay, so that's 6 747s that they're sending out of labor every day. Right? 1 million contracts. They just passed the 1 million contract mark this last year. So it's one of the largest sending. These 8.2 million remit about $16 billion back to the U.S. To the Philippine economy every year, and so that's 10% of GDP now. So that's at least 3 or 4 more times the amount of direct foreign investment. It's 10 times more, or excuse me, 10 times more than direct foreign aid as well. So it's become an enormous part of the economy. So when I started looking at the different, so there are all these laborers out there. They're in nearly every single country. But so the Philippines is becoming the world's largest supplier of nurses, a major supplier of physical therapists and caregivers, and one of the world's largest exporters of maids, and hotel house bands is one of the major things. If you go to any casino in Asia, almost all the time, all the house bands, or you go on a cruise ship, most of the house bands are Filipino. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the Filipino labor diaspora has been going for about the last 30 years, and it spawned a lot of sort of studies on Kathy's Choi book on nurses. There's many folks who've looked at the maids and nannies and entertainers, but most have focused on female labor that's left the Philippines, and so they often talk about the feminization of migration. But in fact, now men are, again, over 50% of Philippine out-migration. But we have this image that everyone leaving the Philippines are women. So the one group that's one of the most dominant niches the Philippines has in any global industry is seafaring, and 98% of those are men. And there are about 290,000 Filipino seafarers on international ships. So it's about 29–30% of all seafarers are from the Philippines. And just this group alone remits $3 billion back to the Philippines every year. So it's enormous. They're per capita send definitely the most. But they're probably the most invisible because they don't go anywhere. We see everyone who else studies migrants studies them in their host country, right? Well, you can't. So I think of them as suspended migrants. They leave. They're treated legally as migrants, but they actually don't go anywhere, right? They're out there in the middle of these ships, so no one actually sees them. So they're quite invisible in a lot of ways. Yet that $3 billion is anything but invisible back in the communities that study in the southern parts. Oftentimes they only become visible, and so this is some of the marketing you'll see often from the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration's, moving the world today, sending them around. You don't hear much about the seafarers unless something really bad happens, like there was a cruise ship exploded a few years ago in Miami, and a bunch of the engine room, five seafarers in the engine room died. The other reason now that they've recently come in the news is all the pirates last April there was this dramatic rescue of the American captain after being held for 4 days. Well, 2 days after that, the Somali pirates captured this one crew of the MV Irene, 23 Filipino crewmen. There's a big sort of effort to try to get them released. They didn't get released for 5 months. They just got released last month. And in fact, the 300 hostages held by Somali pirates this year, 122 of those were Filipino. And so, again, these kind of issues tend to be kind of invisible, and they only come out in these kind of ways. So this is not one of their promotional images that they send around. So what I want to do is, by looking at this particular niche, try to sort of look at, why would one national group dominate, a workforce in a global industry? And in this one, sort of thinking about it, and here you see just the numbers for, this is from a crew survey in the Philippines in terms of where it looks at 4 times, and they're by far the largest group in the global labor market for seafarers. So why would a national group be able to do this? And a lot of people have studied niches, the niches that, sort of ethnic niches, but they tend to be about entrepreneurs, so small business owners, right? Either restaurants or other things, right? So the big question is, how does a group that is not co-ethnics, aren't the owners of capital, how do they become the sort of go-to labor for a particular global niche? And particularly in a transnational one where there's not even a local labor market where you're drawing from, how do you end up dominating a niche where the capital is from all over and you're not in the host country? So those are the kind of questions that I'm thinking about. That again, I'm going to use seafarers as a way to explore this, but hopefully think a little bit more about other Philippine labor streams and then other ways to think about niches and what I'll talk about, sort of the differentiation of different groups in the labor market. And so I would often ask, when I went to the Philippines or other places, this would be my first question in any interview: why do Filipinos dominate the labor market? And when I talk to the government officials or crewing managers and the seafarers themselves, they often would say, well, Filipinos are born to sail. That's the title of my book. That it's somehow innate, that Filipinos, right, well, we're surrounded by water, there's 7,000 islands, so they're naturally good seafarers, right? And I would always say, well, Indonesia is right next door, has twice as many islands, 4 times as many people, and they're almost absent from the labor market. So, and that, most made everyone scratch their head. But I did have one captain said, well, the ancient Filipinos, they had come from the area that's now Indonesia, and when they migrated back up to the Philippine Islands, maybe they took all this good seafarers with them. But this sort of rhetoric of innate ability is what I got very interested in, and particularly when we look at sort of the persistent inequality. So while they dominate numerically, it's a very stratified market. And this just shows sort of the positions. There's sort of 3 major positions on a ship: the senior officers, which is just 2 positions, the captain and the chief engineer; junior officers, and what are called the ratings, which are the sort of unlicensed, the lower level crew guys. Well, in the Philippines, almost all their guys, right, 91% are not senior officers, and most of them, 70%, are the lower end ratings. Where the next largest group is Russia, we see this a very different, sort of much more balanced sort of view. Russian, 29% are senior officers, and only 39% are ratings. So what you have is this ethnically and nationally stratified global labor market. So while Filipinos are in some ways dominant, it doesn't really explain sort of why they become the choice mainly for the bottom. And so to think about sort of that first question is sort of why do Filipinos dominate, has to be coupled with another one, which is why do they remain underrepresented at the top rung? And this plays out in a lot of other sort of occupational niches that Filipinos have been able to come in. So nurses have had this problem in terms of being able to move up in administration or other things, right? They've been able to fill certain positions but not necessarily have mobility within the occupation. It's interesting in the house bands and in entertainers, Filipinos have this reputation of being, naturally musical and natural mimics. This idea that they're good, this sort of Arnel Pineda sort of model, they can sing anything, right? But they don't themselves make good artists. So you have this sort of reputation that goes with them and this sort of stratification. So I want to sort of look at this kinds of stratification. And the last part is to look, well, what does it mean for the workers themselves? How do they construct their own identity, given that this stuff is going on? Do they resist it in different ways? And so what I want to do is look at the seafarer case and try to look at these kind of three elements in terms of the construction of niches. And first I'll look sort of at the socio-historical background, sort of looking at sort of how did they become dominant in seafaring. I'll look at sort of global restructuring, what's going on in the global economy that leads to this sort of the industry's reshaping. Then I'll focus most of the time looking at the contemporary global labor market for seafarers and trying to understand sort of how the competition between different labor groups tends to heighten and racialize difference between labor groups. And here I want to look at really the process of racialization as sort of a political project of a number of the actors, particularly the Philippine state, in trying to differentiate their labor supplies. And then, hopefully if I have time, we'll look at then the call centers and the teachers as in some ways sharing a lot of fundamental things with the sailors. So while teacher, sailor, call center operators seem to be kind of a bit don't have that much in common, there's sort of three things that I think they do share and that are sort of the main points that I want to talk about. First is the institutional and linguistic legacies of colonialism. The second is the state and industry-led development based on promoting a particular kind of labor. And the third is the what I call racialized reputations and the role they play in global labor markets. Okay. So I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about sort of, well, how did the niche in seafaring start? And what I want to argue is that to look at the institutional and sort of linguistic history, two key institutions in the Philippines, American institutions in the Philippines that shaped, before there was a restructuring in the actual labor market, there are these things going on that sort of, sort of preconditions for this sort of creating the supply. And the two sort of institutions I want to look at is the U.S. Navy and the Philippine Nautical School. And so in terms of looking at the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Navy started recruiting Filipinos in 1901, as early as 1901, into the U.S. Navy. But they only recruited them as mess boys and officers' stewards. And so by World War I, there's about 6,000 Filipinos in the Navy. And what was interesting is they were recruited, again, as stewards, mainly to replace African Americans, who had been the former niche holders, right, but had been banned from naval service, part of sort of this racial shift and resegregation after World War I. So by 1930, Filipinos represented 5% of all naval personnel in the U.S. Navy, right, and outnumbered African Americans already 10 to 1 at that point. What's interesting is that this became, this sort of highly racialized division of labor becomes institutionalized and persists well into the 1970s. So Filipinos, again, are the only sort of foreign, quote-unquote, group that's allowed to join the U.S. Navy, but they're only allowed to be at the very bottom, to be either stewards or messmen. And so, you know, their jobs were serving meals, shining officers' shoes, even walking the officers' dogs, or acting as servants for the officers' wives. It was very sort of demeaning work. But after 3 years, if they stayed in the Navy, they were eligible for U.S. citizenship. So that was the real sort of prize for a lot of Filipinos. So, by the 60s, you could be recruited directly through the bases that the U.S. maintained in the Philippines. So you had 100,000 people applying a year to get into, for the 400 slots to get into the U.S. Navy. So you had this enormous sort of flood that people would go, and I have cousins who tried to get in and various things, but you know, this was your ticket to get to the U.S. particularly before 1965. So by 1970, there were 14,000 Filipinos in the U.S. Navy, which is more Filipinos than in the Philippine Navy, right? So you had this enormous amount. By 1970, they are starting to be allowed to move into other positions other than steward and messman, but in 1970s, 80% were still basically stewards or messmen. So just as they started opening up the different areas for Filipinos in the Navy, basically after Vietnam, they decided to slow down the recruitment. They didn't need to recruit so many into the Navy, and so they started lowering the amount, and by the mid-70s, they were basically not recruiting Filipinos into the Navy at all, and by 1992, they cut it off completely when the Philippines finally kicked the U.S. out of the Philippines. So right in 1970, as it's ramping up in terms of the desire to go into the U.S. Navy, they're shutting down a lot of the recruitment. And that'll be important when you look at the timing of when does the merchant shipping labor market opens up. So the second important institution is the Philippine Nautical School, which is again, this is an institution set up by, first originally in 1820 by the Spanish, but when the U.S. takes over, they immediately rename it Philippine Nautical School. And the most important thing is that they make everything in English, all instructions in English, and the certifications then are changed to reflect U.S. military, U.S. merchant marine training. And so by sort of World War II, after World War II, the Philippine Nautical School, the U.S. takes some of their graduates there and sends them to Kings Point, New York. And so in 2 batches, 100 Filipino officers went to Kings Point, New York to train as officers in the U.S. Merchant Marine. But because they were Filipino and not in U.S., they were now Filipino citizens and not nationals, they couldn't serve as officers either in the U.S. Merchant Marine or the U.S. Navy. So they had trained them to be officers, but they weren't allowed to serve in the U.S. So many of them returned to the Philippines, and they became the backbone of the Philippine sort of institutions there, which became the Philippine Merchant Marine Academy and the Philippine Navy. So what happened was the certification, the training, all the standards, all the curriculum were based on the U.S. Merchant Marine model, right? Which was, at that point, the U.S. had the largest merchant marine in the world, so they had the sort of de facto global sort of standards. That's what everything was set up in the Philippines as, right? So this is, so the curriculum, so what happens is you have then groups of people who see seafaring as a viable sort of mode of mobility, right? Migration, people wanting to go. Then you had some training, at least for officers, that was based on the U.S. standard. So what happens is, around the same time in the 60s, you start getting, and particularly in the oil crisis in the 70s, shipping gets deregulated. The global industry becomes deregulated. It used to be that if you had a ship, if you had an American ship, you had to fly American flag, and you had to have Americans sailing on it, right? Citizens. And that was sort of for all the different, whether it's Norway or Greece or Germany or other main sort of maritime powers. Well, because of the deregulation of shipping, they were able to flag their ships not in their home country but offshore. So Panama and Liberia became the 2 largest countries where you can flag your ships. And that's still, if you see, whenever you hear about an accident or something, and they'll have the flag of the ship, and it doesn't always make sense. You can flag your ship in Bolivia, for example, with no coastline at all, right? So the idea is that it's basically a deregulated flag. And because you do that, you can then hire people from any country. You no longer have to hire your own seafarer. So the Americans, the Greek, and the Norwegians, and the Germans start looking elsewhere. Now that they can hire anyone, who are they going to go to? Well, here's the supply of seafarers, speak English, and have certifications based on the U.S. model, but a whole lot cheaper. And so you have this opening up of the labor market that, you have this at about the same time. So you see, and this was taken just a couple years ago at one of the merchant marine academies in the Philippines. You see this, speak English, world-class professionals speak English, English-only speaking zones, very much sort of modeled on the U.S. sort of military academy style. Today in the Philippines has the world's largest number of accredited maritime education and training institutes, 76 universities and colleges, 41 training centers, over 100,000 students, and they churn out about 16,000 sort of graduates a year just in the maritime area, right? So it's this enormous sort of push. Unfortunately, there's only about 5,000 available new jobs every year. So while there's 290,000 Filipinos on ships, there's another 250 to 300,000 who aren't on ships, who want to get on ships, right? So while they are a dominant group in the labor force, there's a lot of competition for those kind of jobs. Okay. So this sort of explains sort of the idea is that there's a supply because of the U.S. institutions that prepares them, the preconditions for this. Then there's the opening up of the labor market. But it's sort of still trying to figure out sort of, well, why Filipinos? We understand why they're looking for cheap labor, but how do the Filipinos end up filling that niche? Okay? And so what I want to focus on is thinking about sort of the role that the marketing and sort of how you bring your labor to market, and the role that the state and brokers and the sort of migration industry play in this. And what I want to focus on is the idea of sort of looking at sort of racialization, how you differentiate your labor as a group. And so I want to talk about race but as a process, as sort of this definition of the naturalization of cultural difference, right? And just to give you an example, you can see how that it plays that different groups involved in the racialization. Often it's studied as racialization or opportunity hoarding, is that dominant groups are the ones that are racializing the others. And what I want to say is, yes, that's definitely part of it, but groups themselves and their advocates also are involved in this process of racialization, right? And in this case, they're trying to make a claim that they're the best at this particular thing. So they're trying to make a claim, but that can also then, we'll see how that claim looks like, how that can also then hurt them in the labor market as they try to move up. Just as an example, I just want to use some language you see about the recruiting of nurses, again, one of the largest niches that Filipinos have. And this sort of idea, when I ask not me, when this is from other research, but when it's asked, what are the advantages of hiring Filipino nurses? Why do they dominate the niche? The nurse, in this case, says, nursing comes naturally to us, right? Because we're generally a very caring people. Again, it's kind of naturalizing that Pinoy care is what, sort of is the difference than other ones. Now, the placement agent has quite a slightly different. Filipino nurses are the favorite because of the tender loving care, yes, but it's also their language, which is human capital. They're pleasant, right? Well scrubbed and uncomplaining, right? So you start seeing the naturalization. It's tied to that caring, but there are these other things that are much more tied to the requirements of the low end of the labor market, right? Because what do the people want at the low end of the labor market, right? Tends to be good subordinates, right? People who are going to listen and do. So the last group here, the hospital point of view, well, Filipinos are extremely respectful, right? Family members, they're flexible, willing to take new assignments at the spur of the moment, and willing to work extra long hours, right? So you get this naturalization from caring to sort of willing to work long hours. Again, you're getting traits that are really driven by the labor demand that are becoming naturalized as they're good at doing overtime, right? So with seafarers, it ends up coming very similarly. So this is just from the mid-70s. You have this sort of vision. This is from a brochure that Filipinos have a natural affinity to the sea. So here it comes. Since 320 AD, they've been known for their skills. What's interesting is building ships because they sailed on galleons. But then they go on. It says what makes them truly the most dependable are these inherent traits: adaptable, hardworking, charm and friendliness, makes for a harmonious relationship, and they keep within set rules and regulations. Again, particularly on the hierarchy of a kind on a ship, where it's very much a military hierarchy and discipline, right? These are what they're looking for in the subordinates. And the idea is that they become naturally like that. This is just from this summer. What's interesting is that the migration industry, right, not just the state, is reinforcing this, of course, because they have a stake in it as well. This is from a research review from one of the maritime universities that I went to, which really is sort of in the business, the private university, of promoting their labor abroad. But it's that in the past, now that the competition with Chinese, the Filipino officers are better than 4 Chinese officers, right? They're known for their communication, courteous, polite, hardworking, and flexible. Again, these are seen as Filipino traits, that they're national, right? That there's something innate about them. And this is just an image from one of the largest sending companies. They said there's an internal brochure that looks at how great it is to be a Filipino seafarer. How much fun. To the point that even they'll say, again, it's just another example, as it moves, now it's not just bulk carriers, but it's also in cruise ships. And so now there's moving from that it's not just subordinate, right, but there's a need to be subservient, right? Not just do it, but do it with a smile, right? So when you employ, you have skill, right, with a heart. Filipinos are nature a warm people who exude, naturally exude customer service. And this is what makes them competent, but also pleasant to work with, right? So again, you see that the natural traits shift as the demands in the labor market shift, right? To the point that you have even this. Filipinos even smell better, right? Was this idea that Filipinos' love of baths have been advantageous, right? They're recognized for exceptional hygiene and personal grooming, right? And it's not escaped shipping companies. And it says Filipinos are well known for their cleanliness in contrast to other nationalities who don't prioritize everyday personal hygiene, right? So it's sort of how do you differentiate and demean your competition. And it's also interesting at the end, Filipino seafarers are also cool-headed, right? And they don't figure in too many fights or brawls, right? So think about what are the demands of the, on a ship. You're in tight quarters, and it's a very regimented and hierarchical. This idea that they'll listen, they'll be flexible, adaptable, right, is that they will be subordinate. And they're naturally so, right? So again, the idea is that they could fulfill this. So this is what I mean, sort of the natural, sort of the construction that's by different people. What I wanted to do, sort of, as I did this research, was also see how do the seafarers themselves sort of see this kind of thing. So I spent about 18 days at 3 different times on ships with different crews. And so I went on one with an all-Filipino crew. Usually the crew of a ship is only about 20, 21 people. Another one was a mix with Japanese, Indian, and Filipino labor. And the last one was mixed Korean and Filipino. And one was a chemical tanker, and 2 were these bulk carriers. And what I was interested naively when I first started was like, well, I know that this is happening out in the labor market, but when you get out in the middle of nowhere, would that stuff still apply? When you're in the middle of nowhere, you know, literally no place, are those differences among nationality, is it possible to sort of transcend some of those things? So you know, I've been reading a lot of Gilroy and others on hybridity and the idea of sort of these spaces where you might be able to transcend these boundaries. And what I found out actually was the opposite, right? That C's were some of the most racist guys I'd ever come across. But you have to understand it in the context that they have this overdetermined difference when they get on the ship, precisely because they're nowhere in particular, that they tended to racialize the spaces on board. And that there were times when people definitely did get together, and what I'll talk about sort of boundary crossing, or at least boundary blurring, but often because of the hierarchy of the ship and the way that the labor market's set up, it tended to overdetermine these things, and you tended to reinforce rather than to sort of relax these kinds of relationships. So one of the things is that ships, right, are a strange thing. They're really like a transnational total institution. You have nowhere to go. It makes a good field site because your respondents can't go anywhere. And you can't go anywhere, so you got to write up your notes and stuff. But you're there. It's just sort of very much a 24/7 sort of a life that you're on board. A lot of the Filipinos are on there. They're going from 9 months as a standard contract to 12 months that they're on the ship. And actually, one of these, I can only do my field works in the summer. I went on one ship in the summer. I spent a whole year teaching, doing everything the rest of my life, and I got back on that same ship. There was a guy who was still on that for 12 months he had been on the same ship crossing. He hadn't been home, hadn't seen his kids, hadn't seen his family. Right? It's also a dangerous job, and so some people, they described it that being on a ship was like a paid prison sentence with a good chance of drowning. And just think about that idea. It's paid, right? You're doing, it's prison, but you're paid, so it's voluntary, right? Plus you have this added sort of dimension of danger, because it is one of the most, you know, in terms of injuries, one of the, you know, highest occupational hazard jobs. So this is sort of in looking at what's going on. So as I started looking at sort of, well, then how do they conceive of themselves in terms of constructing their own identities? And a lot of times it's very much relationally compared to their competitors. So here the Filipinos often run up into, they become career junior officers or lower level people. So they have a lot of experience because they're not able to move up. And they're often, you know, a lot of the Europeans, because there's so few of them, they move up the ranks really quickly. And they come right out of the merchant marine academies. And so the way they often look at it, so I had a chief mate who was foreign, right? We are doing troubleshooting, he handles a book. The Filipinos are laughing at him because the problem is too simple. They rely too much on books and they don't hold tools. Society, they don't have it. Again, so here we see another kind of construction of racialization, if you want, but in a different way. It's not for being good at subordinate, it's for their competency and their creativity. So it's this kind of subordinate adaptation. Again, it's one way that they rescue some of their agency, but at the same time, they're reinforcing these kind of boundaries. Now, their most sort of virulent comments tended to be about their most direct competitor. And so Chinese and Indian were the ones, and you have a similar sort of thing. Chinese, they're like hourly employees. They'll quit, right, in the middle of a job. But not the Filipino. He'll work until the job is finished, right? Or the Indian is lazy. Here's another one. The 1 equals 4. I kept hearing that same thing. It could have been, you know, Filipinos 1 equals 4, Indian, or it makes 10, another different group, but they would often use that sort of thing. So 1 Filipino equals 4 Indians. Their ships will be rusty, and the Filipinos will always look clean, no rust. So again, this sort of construction of difference within the labor market, you know, with their competitors. In looking at sort of how then these sort of identities get structured on the ship, I take from Richard Alba this idea of looking at boundary making, and that some boundaries are bright and some are blurry, right? Meaning some can be crossed or be kind of contested, while others are less. And what I looked at is the physical shape of the ship. Can you imagine you're living for a whole year with everyone you work with? Think of everyone at your work. And if you had to live all the time with them, right? That's what it's like on the ship. So people find different spaces. And what's interesting is that these different spaces get have different sort of feelings. So if here I call bright spaces where the boundaries become stronger, tend to be those places where there's a boundary reinforcement, like the bridge, where it's very, only the captain can sit down. It's very hierarchical. So when you're in that space, the difference is very stark. And the thing is that most of the racial hierarchy matches the occupational one. So again, where occupational hierarchy gets reinforced tends to reinforce these other kinds of boundaries. Officers' mess was a similar thing. Here I didn't know it, but all the different seats were by, this was the captain's seat, that was the chief officer's, and everyone had their seat. It was not marked, but when I came in, it created a real problem because I would sit down and I was taking someone's space. And this is the junior officer's table. So I didn't know it, but the first officer would normally sit here. I sat there. He had nowhere to sit. He wouldn't sit with the junior officers. So he ended up just waiting till I finished. That was why. Or I ended up eating in the crew mess, which is a little less hierarchical. But it's very much a very hierarchical space. Because of the time, I'm not going to go into too much. I was going to talk a little bit about how the spaces get on the mixed ships when there was some tension, where there would be different spaces would be where particular groups would sort of carve out, even though they're across. Because most of the spaces are sort of by hierarchy, so an area for officers and an area for sort of unlicensed. What was interesting in the ship with the Korean and the Filipinos, that not all of them, the bosun is not an officer, so he couldn't hang out in the officers' mess with the other Koreans. So they had to find another area where it became Korean space, the cargo control room. It wasn't occupationally hierarchical, and that became the area that again, there was a lot of tension on the ship, so they hung out there. The same in the Filipino engine room. The engine room is usually just for officers. There was one Filipino chief officer, but he allowed the other Filipinos there in that space when there was tension vis-a-vis the Koreans. So you would see this sort of deactivation of sort of occupational hierarchy when there was ethnic tension. So it's just interesting in terms of space. We could talk a little bit more about that. So it's a little complicated, but we have questions. There were some places where that wasn't so strong. And here, what I call blurry spaces or occasions, there would be times, birthday parties, a lot of karaoke, for example, things like that, where it would be okay and where you could actually blur some of these hierarchies. These tended to happen more often in the full crew Filipino ship because there was less sort of tension, where we could play basketball. Again, you can see you have to put up a big net because of the ball bounces out, that's it. You lose your ball when in the middle of the Pacific. There you would have officers playing, enlisted men, and you could have sort of this blurring of hierarchy. There were certain times when here's the Japanese officer, Indian, and Filipino around music. Certain events would lead to a sort of a blending of the hierarchy. Food was another where the Koreans were trying to teach the Filipino cook how to cook for Korean food. So there were elements when these things could break down, but for the most part, what you tended to find was a reinscription of sort of racial difference rather than this sort of the other way around when we're on the ship. Okay, I know I'm flying through some of this because I wanted to talk about the two other possible projects or projects I'm thinking about and how they fit in this sort of thinking about sort of global labor, racialization, and how all the different actors sort of participate in that. And the one that I want to sort of move to think about is a project that I was in the Philippines this summer looking at, which is to look at this sort of new export processing zone in the Philippines. My first work that Chris mentioned was on electronics manufacturing, and that was also in export processing zones in the Philippines. What's interesting now is that there's this sort of new generation that's moved from, so the first and second generations of zones were about low-end manufacturing. The third generation was for high-end electronics manufacturing. This new generation of zone now isn't manufacturing at all, but it's services, it's business services, right? And so the new export processing zone is no longer this place for sort of sweatshop, sort of sewing, but they're call centers. Right? And they're actually legally the same as an export processing zone, but they're exporting information in Philippine voice. So it's very interesting that the product's different, but legally it's all sort of the same. So you have mainly in Manila these these IT parks now. They're trying to spread them out outside of Manila as well, but that's mainly where they've been concentrated. Most of the industry, of course, business process outsourcing, again, if we think of, we had this globalization of shipping, and we have for information technology, because of the technology, you have this incredible globalization of different kind of services. So all of a sudden now, there's the possibility that you can have, you know, all your back office work done somewhere else, right? You can have call centers offshore. You can have even more sophisticated stuff like reading of X-rays done offshore and things like that, right? So the IT has enabled the movement of a new kind of work to move offshore. So here we see it not that Philippine labor is moving, it's still Philippine labor that's the key here, but it's coming to the Philippines in this case. So it's still about what's going on. What's interesting is that the Philippine industry has exploded in large part because there's been a backlash in India. That there's been a backlash, so 67% of the industry in the Philippines now is call centers. So unlike India that has sort of taken it much more in the IT and the software development, the Philippines is really, the niche that they have is really call centers. And a lot of that investment is actually coming maybe from US companies to India, and then India is outsourcing it to the Philippines. Why? Because there's this backlash against the Indian accents. And there's two kind of calls in call centers, inbound and outbound, right? One is a call center, you call and you have a question, right? The other is sales, debt collection, and all the ones you don't want to talk to, you have telemarketing. And they say they need a different facility of language with that, and that the heavy Indian accent is harder for that kind of work, and so that's the stuff that's coming to the Philippines. So you have this sort of image of Filipinos, again, this naturalization, that Filipinos are better, they have a different kind of accent. Again, clearly tied to Filipino or American colonialism in the Philippines, right? That English becomes the mode of instruction, but also a familiarity with sort of American pop culture is what becomes there, again, in the competition for these kind of jobs. It's really this, that it's natural that they're able to adapt, they have neutral accents, right, as opposed to the Indians. And so you're having this move into the call centers and non-intensive jobs. And so this is being pressed both by the state, again, that they're trying to draw on the investment. So the state is clearly part of doing this, and they have the Business Process Association of the Philippines that is sort of a quasi-governmental private sort of cooperation that sort of markets Philippine call centers abroad. And they've been involved. They're trying to actually shift the national curriculum in English teaching because the Philippines now has this sort of niche in voice. They're saying, well, but there's actually poor quality of English, you need more training. And so the English curriculum, the industry is trying to push the curriculum to move to be more about dialogue and voice, right, rather than writing. And so they're trying to shift the national curriculum on how you teach English based on the demand for call centers. Okay? And the government's hearing this, right? They're considering changing. They have a whole campaign called the English is Cool, or, you know, speak English only campaigns and things like that, right? All driven mainly by, again, by market demand, but definitely supplemented by the state. What's interesting when I was there, and I did interview some call center workers, that they very much sort of know this sort of competition with India. And this is from a book. It's just a cartoon by call center workers. The main character is this guy Clover. And this is a cartoon of a call center worker jokes, basically. But what's interesting is sort of how they, again, this sort of racialization that also happens among sort of groups that compete. So it's from the book, Helen Manzano's work, Call Center Life. I can lower my handling time, right? They're trying to figure out how they don't have to spend so much time because they're penalized if they're on the phone too long. So they want to have a quick turnover. Even if it's just a hang-up, that's okay, right? And so Clover uses, again, a very racist way to look at sort of using this Indian language. And so the other guy says, wow, you know, your customer thought you were Indian, so he just hung up, right? But so, again, you have this sort of competition at the global level, you know, created by the globalization of services. You have this competition of different groups, right? And then you have the racialization on both sides in order to reinforce that difference, trying to promote their difference, right? So this is just, so this is an ongoing project, but I just see similar sort of construction. I want to get let's talk a little bit about the last group of sort of in terms of a niche, which is Filipino teachers. And this is sort of a new sort of niche, and I'm just starting a project with a professor of education up at SantaCruz, who's been doing the actual research, mainly in Los Angeles. And she had been working on the global trained teachers in the U.S. And other places like South Africans in England and other places. But basically, when she started looking at this, and she started looking at the LA district, she found that the vast majority of them were from the Philippines. And so she came to me and thinking, oh, what's up with all these Filipino teachers, these Filipino migrants, and started trying to look at sort of this emergent thing. And I don't know if you see, very recently there are a couple big cases in Louisiana where they nailed this placement agent for charging the Filipino teachers $15,000 placement fee, plus taking, I think it was 10% of their monthly wages for 2 years. And the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, just put out a report about sort of the emergence of teachers. The largest group of those teachers, the big concentrations are Texas and Houston, specifically in Baltimore, Georgia, and Los Angeles. And I'll show you some numbers in terms of looking at, here's about the number. They're estimated, it's hard to tell exactly because they don't really keep records, but about 19,000 sort of overseas trained teachers, right? And what's going on? Well, it's not that the American schools we don't have enough teachers, is that they're clearly in some areas, right, high poverty schools, rural isolated schools, and in certain areas, math and science, and particularly special ed, are where there's still sort of teacher shortages. And so what happens is, poor school districts, right, can't compete in getting it. So they usually get underqualified teachers. They get teachers in training, and they get emergency credential. That's the way they fill their gap. Well, with the No Child Left Behind, they had to have more qualified teachers. And so the poor school districts were in a conundrum because they had to actually produce more qualified teachers. So what did they do? That's when they started going abroad, looking for other teachers to fill that gap. So here you see, in terms of, this is just overseas trained teachers in California, this big jump, right? In 2001, No Child Left Behind, the H-1B visas, which are the visas that they come under, a 3-year visa of temporary labor, professional labor, that increases to 195,000. So you had this big jump in sort of overseas trained teachers in California. And so in this area, this thing, for example, one of the poorest districts in California, in LA, was able to reduce the number of uncredentialed teachers from 2/3 of all their teachers in their district to less than 25%, mainly because they recruited about 1,400 Filipino teachers, right, just in LA alone. And so you have Compton, San Bernardino, Inglewood are all these areas where they've been recruiting Filipino teachers. They get an emergency credential. They're credentialed already in the Philippines. And the thing is, because they're getting the best teachers in the Philippines, right, because it's this opportunity to come to the United States, so for the kids in the classroom, right, they're actually getting much more highly qualified teachers, right, into their classroom. So for the kids themselves, for the education, it could be quite a good thing. But those school districts in the Philippines are losing all their best teachers, right, to Baltimore, to Houston. And so part of our project that we haven't done is to study the Philippine side, look at the impact on sending schools and communities to this thing. So there was a cap. The reason you have this big decline in large part in 2004 is not because the demand wasn't there, but they capped the H-1B visas, so they couldn't bring in any more people. So again, it's not that demand is going down that you have a slight dip. It's mainly because there's been a backlash against, basically against immigrant labor professionals. This just from where they're sending them just gives you an idea. This is from the sending side. U.S. is the biggest one, about 1,000, almost 1,000 in 2008, but also other places, mainly in different parts of the world, a lot from into the Middle East. So again, you see this, and it's hard. How does this happen? Well, one of the things that the Philippines has is their embassies have the Philippine Overseas Labor Offices. So they have 35 of these offices around the world, in places like Greece, UK, Spain, Switzerland, Netherlands, Libya, Lebanon, Kuwait, on and on. And they sort of act as labor market information gatherers, right? They basically, so one of the always question is, how do they link up, how do they find out about these niches and demands? The Philippine state has it set up that they kind of collect labor market information data from their embassies. These polo offices, as they're called, are set up, and they produce their own marketing information I think even monthly, to let people know back in the Philippines where the jobs are. So you have this sort of incredible, again, role of sort of labor brokers here. The state is able to sort of get the information back to the Philippines. This just shows a little bit about, in California, how much, again, in looking at this, some of the data, it's hard to get because this is from the California Credentialing Office. They have to keep tabs on who's getting credentials, right, in California. So this shows, in terms of looking at the numbers of credentials of overseas trained teachers. Philippines is 22%, so it's definitely the largest group in terms of the number of, the percentage who are coming from the Philippines of all the overseas trained teachers. It's definitely the largest. This shows you the number just from California. Okay, so I know I'm flying through all this, but I wanted to make sure that we get, I wanted to tell a more detailed story about the seafarers to look at how it happens in one case, but look at sort of these other cases as well to just think about sort of the process of niche formation and development, but to look particularly and highlight the historical and sort of institutional elements of this and how that plays a role in sort of the naturalization, how that becomes a process. So really, again, is to look first in thinking about all three streams are heavily influenced by American colonial institutions, right, and policies that have these long-standing impacts and also help create these preconditions for Filipino incorporation, and some would say differential incorporation into the global economy. So having English as the sort of lingua franca, right, prepares them to be voice workers as well as sort of teachers and seafarers, again, all places where they need to speak English. And then the certification education systems. All three streams have been heavily influenced by the restructuring of the globalized economy. Deregulation of all these industries led to the sort of offshoring and outsourcing of a lot of this work. Deindustrialization and the move towards services also clearly has an impact. And then to look, so you need to look at that and sort of segmented labor markets as these things open up, where they're looking for work. The second sort of big idea is, besides looking at the institutions and history, is that niches clearly shouldn't be seen as things, right, but as processes and political projects of networks of institutions, but above all states. Particularly as the Philippine state has seen this as their most viable and most successful development strategy, right? Nation states, again, threatened by globalization, are faced with sort of a imploding sort of domestic development strategy, have pushed to this model of exporting its workers. And in doing that, the state, as well as the migration industry, actively intervene through sort of labor market promotion and disciplinary policies that really try to create social closure and niche closure around these particular areas, right? So they're trying to construct Filipinos as particularly well suited for these secondary labor market positions. The irony, of course, is that, and tragedy of this strategy is that, how do you stay competitive is only if you're cheap, it's going to be cheaper. So it requires, right, that the GDP growth and wages in the Philippines remain depressed in order to stay competitive on the global market. And that's actually, when I talked to some ship owners in Japan who had like 80% of their seafarers from one country, from the Philippines, and I said, don't you feel like you're over-dependent on one source? And he says, no, I look at the GDP of a country, and if it hits over, I think it was $1,000, then I know that, like China, they don't go with Chinese labor because they're not likely to stay in seafaring, because they have opportunities back in China. If you can have a shore job, why be out on the ship, right? And so he says, we're actually not sourcing from China as much because it's not attractive. They have options. He says, the Philippines, we don't see any problem. And, it's going to continue to be bad in the domestic economy, so we're not worried about depending on one supply. And so as niches shouldn't be seen as things, race needs to similarly be looked at as a process and a project, right? And that labor market competition, when it becomes more global, differentiation between groups becomes more important, not less, right? And so that, and then looking at sort of one of the most common sort of strategies of differentiation then is the naturalization of cultural difference, right? And so and states clearly play a huge role. As Nina Glick-Schiller wrote, the process of racialization is a central mechanism through which national identity gets linked to state structures. Right? The idea that national identity is very connected to race and racialization, particularly in global markets. And so Filipino migrants, they do resist and define themselves in positive ways, but they often do so in ways that sort of reinforce the divisions between groups. Right? They're saying it's not because we're subordinate, it's because we're competent, but it's still a differentiation tactic, right? They're not saying we're all seafarers and we should all fight together as seafarers, an occupational identity, right, that's positive. They're focusing on a national and racial identity in competition with other groups, and which has made sort of solidarity tougher. So, you know, in the end, while I went into it trying to look at sort of, you know, is it possible to transcend some of these racial and national boundaries and create these things on ships, that, you know, people like James Clifford or Ian Eng talk about, sort of achieving this kind of hybridity. While it's not impossible by looking at sort of the context of the global economy, I'm just a lot more skeptical of, in that context, whether it is in fact possible. Or at least having to look through how the labor market segments says a lot of why that's just that much more difficult task. That's it. The last bit of stereotypes. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, I know I was flying through that. My eye was on the clock a lot of time, so I'd get time for questions if people have them. I know I speak fast, so I'm sorry for that.
I think this is daylight savings, so we're good.
No, okay.
They haven't.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the seafaring case prior to the deregulation? Like, who did the work there, and what happened to those people? Or was it ever? I think it was, but I don't really remember. Was it ever unionized, and what happened to that? Like the whole sort of prelude to the story you told.
You know, thanks. That's a good question. Before they deregulated, it was heavily unionized. Again, this is why they wanted to be able to move offshore so that they could hire anyone and sort of subvert that. So the flag of convenience, International Transport Federation has had a flag of convenience campaign for a long time to try to get rid of that because it decimated their numbers, right? Because the Philippines, actually, a lot of them are in a union, but the wage is set by country. So they have bargaining by country. So what happened was, at least for the Norwegians and Germans, for example, their national flags registry, their companies, they agreed to allow them to have what's called the second registry, which is, you know, a foreign registry, but they said, but we want to maintain the officer positions. So they were able to negotiate opening up only the bottom of the labor market, right? And the numbers were that they didn't have enough people, so there was a tight labor market in these countries. So they were able to save the junior officer and senior officer positions. And so if you look on the Greek ships and German ships, those are one of the only places where you have lots of nationals still there, right?
So that explains those bar graphs you showed us, maybe.
Right, in terms of thinking about, yeah, where
what happens to everybody else? Do you know?
You know, what happens, they leave shipping. It becomes that they just leave. So in the British case, a lot of them just, you know, they retire, and ITF is still active, and they try to incorporate all these new streams, and the Philippines has an active union, but you know, those unionists basically, it's basically the age of somewhat of a demographic shift. A lot of people just moved out of seafaring. You know, you can imagine if you could live, you know, work onshore, why would you be on board? That said, you can negotiate for better conditions. So if you're an English seafarer now, you only go on, your contract is only for 6 weeks. That's as long as you go out. Then you get to go back home. That's somewhat manageable. On the ships, they have internet, so you have constant contact, right? Not so at the lower end of the labor, so at the lower end, they're on, again, as long as 12 months. And a lot of times they have no internet's only for the captain because it's expensive, right? So their conditions, they're small numbers. And American seafarers, for example, in tankers, oil coming from Alaska, going down to Chevron in Richmond or somewhere, those are all in U.S., and so they have to be U.S. seafarers. So there's still a market. There are still Americans sailing on ships, but not on international routes. But it basically put an enormous sort of cost pressure on them. Yeah.
Well, I just want to play devil's advocate and say, what if you try to tell the story just in terms of sort of cheapness, competency, and accessibility through these Philippine government recruitment offices? Do you really need all this stuff about natural warmth and so on? What's the nature of these kind of recruitment processes for seafarers, for teachers, and for that matter, call center selection? You know, where do you choose to put your call center? How much do you think that it really makes a difference, all this, you know, PR about warmth and subservience and so on? How much of it is these other factors that are really key?
Right. No, I mean, this, I thought, you know, if you look just at price, then one of the ways that it doesn't completely make sense, or that doesn't explain it all, is that Filipinos, in terms of their percentages, they're a much higher percentage of junior and even some senior officers in different fleets. So Filipinos are, even though the same cost to everyone, they would be, you know, there's different levels of representation on Greek-owned ships, German-owned, and Japanese-owned. And they actually have the highest sort of percentage of representation in the Japanese. Now, I went to this office when I was on the ship. I rode on the ship and then got off in Japan and spent some time in the office of the company, and precisely to look at sort of what's the calculus in terms of how they choose. What was interesting was that the company did natural experiments with different groups. They like to have they don't like to have full crew because they sense they lose control. What happens in shipping, right, is you own the ship and you send it out there, and it's completely remote. So if you're the owner, you don't really know what's happening, right? So in terms of labor process, you sort of lose control of your ship out there. So they actually prefer a mixed crew, 2 or 3 nationalities, but they don't like too many more than that, right? And so it's interesting that it's actually a strategy, and then they try it out. They say, okay, we'll try this group. We'll sail 6 ships with Korean captains and Burmese crew. And they'll send them out, and then they actually see in terms of the time. In that case, the relationships between people matter. Time in port, turnaround time. They actually measure all those stuff. What was interesting, while they were looking at those calculations, the way they sourced it, the guy in the office who sourced mainly the senior officers was South Asian. He was Indian himself, who almost hired only South Asians and sometimes Korean. They had a guy for the top officers, and they still needed Japanese. They had the guy, the manager for that was Japanese, and the people who filled basically the lower end were all Filipino. So they had a sort of in-group preference for that. So when I interviewed each individually, they're the ones who would say, and they're the decision makers. And so here, in thinking about the migration industry and the people who make the decisions, while they're clearly, you know, in the office looking at the numbers in terms of cost, they're also reinforced. I was surprised how much race was part of why they thought different groups work. And I think it was a lot in terms of the construction of who gets along. So the Filipinos were known as good followers, right? That's their reputation. And Indians are not. So they say, oh, well, Indians, they quarrel too much, they talk too much, they make good leaders, but they don't make very good followers. And so they'll put Indian officers with Filipino crew, but they almost never put a Filipino officer and an Indian crew. So it gets reinforced in the practice, I think, is what happens. I mean, I think that's clearly the main driver is cost. But something like EPZs, export processing zones, one thing that every country can have the same kind of package in terms of tax breaks, infrastructure, things like that. Those are purchasable, right? So you can compete with China if they lower their tax holiday, or then this other country can too, right? So those aren't you can't compete as well. But if it's on human capital that you can't change very quickly, so Filipino voice has less of an accent, right? There's no way so the other countries compete on that same level again. So I think you're right. It's lots of it has to do with sort of finding the low cost. But there's a human element in all of these that race becomes a factor in the decision.
I want to follow up on that question about race. If in the other era of globalization 100 years ago, an American foreman at a lumber yard or an iron plant wanted to hire people, they would go to a broker and say, give me 50 Irishmen, 50 Poles, and whatever, but not too many Irishmen, they get drunk, not too many Poles, they have bad bathing habits, whatever. The key thing wasn't racial, it was stereotype or even the national cultural institutions, whether people grew up being better fed, stronger, whatever. that's the first part of why I'm not convinced it's race. The second, are there racial differences within the Philippines that are seen in these industries? For example, in India, you've got the Tamil Brahmins who dominate the IT industry, dominate the BPO industry. It's not, to say it's the Indians are good at IT or whatever is overgeneralized when it's a specific group that's done a lot of what we see.
Yeah, there's definitely one of the interesting things on the ship when I went with a full Filipino crew. There's a lot of regional differences, and linguistic differences within the Philippines, and so Tagalogs tend to dominate. And what was interesting is that they would, again, in space, in different ways, there'd be areas where the Visayans hung out and other people hung out. So there were differences. What happened? What was interesting is that when then a multinational crew, they take on much more of a Filipino identity than a national one. So I'm not saying it's all race. I think we would get to the naturalization of cultural difference. Is this sort of how do you, they're somehow innate and immutable. It's sort of, clearly it's not immutable, right? The idea that your sort of historical example, I think it happens now too, but so it does segment in labor markets. So hunkies or those who can withstand heat, right, were the ones who work blast furnaces and things like that. There was then other kinds of areas of mobility that broke down those stereotypes. So I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but clearly that process is still ongoing. And what's interesting is in transnational labor markets, and particularly for seafaring, right, there's less areas for that kind of mobility. Now they have been trying to move up this summer I was at this maritime academy to see, have they been able to move the standards? Can they push into senior officer positions? Mainly just because of demographic change, they're aging. In Japanese ships, they have been able to move up. And in those cases, to some extent, you do see, when you finally have a Filipino officer that does prove to be a good captain, you start to be able to break down something. But it's still the exception rather than the rule. So I'm not saying it's totally immutable, but I'm just saying that the reasons they segment lie in part with sort of race, and that there is a tendency to reinforce those, at least to capture the first row. And the problem is that for the Filipinos, if they sell themselves as good followers, right, then they become, then they're naturally not good at being leaders, and they get not necessarily locked out, but not as considered as highly as other groups. Yeah.
So this is all reminding me of some of the sort of gender rationalizations that you see, very parallel to this, when women move into a new occupation. So, my favorite example of that is from during World War II, the so-called Rosary Riveters. Whatever jobs they were employed in suddenly were discovered by management to have attributes that made women suitable for them. So some of you might have seen that old film, The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter, has these newsreel notes. Anyway, so they would say things like, this is propaganda newsreels. So-and-so is cutting the lines, is cutting out airplane parts. It's just like cutting the pieces of a dress. Yeah. Or this one, so there were all these endless, I'm just supporting criticism, I don't know your name's point, that maybe some of this is, it's possible to generate those, that's what you're talking about, this process of rationalization or naturalization for pretty much any job and link it to either a gender or a nationality or a race or whatever. But what's really causing the assignment of people to places in the division of labor is something else, maybe. So that this is sort of an after the fact. Your story is a little more complicated because of this huge role of the state in orchestrating all this and maybe even generating some of the rationalizations on its own, right? But otherwise it seems very similar to all these other ones that people are bringing up.
I'm not trying to say that it's the reason that it's sort of it, but to understand why mobility is so difficult. And
once it gets set up, that's right, the boundaries become very rigid.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a look at sort of this idea, looking at boundary. And I guess for me, it's really the story of people who see these boundaries as easy to cross. In fact, they're much harder because they're institutionally based, right? Rather than sort of this other way around. But I wouldn't disagree that it's that there's a post facto. They get this, therefore they're good at this kind of thing. But it does mean that again, sort of that it becomes, at least for a time, harder to conceive of other people doing it, and there's a lot of inertia in these segmented labor markets. Yeah.
Thanks for the terrific talk. I'm wondering if you might talk just briefly about the changing attitudes about, because we can see how, in terms of recruitment, and then either it's reinforced or it's not on the actual job. It just reminds me of a joke. It basically goes something like this: among doctors in the U.S., how do you say "fu" in Tagalog? And the answer is yes, doctor. Which points to a pretty sophisticated development of racial meaning, right? That good service providers, but then also a kind of recalcitrance, a kind of almost kind of colonial or anti-colonial mimicry of subservience. Well, and I'm wondering if, either on board ship or with other interviews that you've done, if you've noticed the transformation of some of those meanings, the way that even a Filipino accent on a call center might now start to have that tinge of ominousness, I guess, that the Indian accent.
There definitely were sort of, and this is what I didn't get into, is sort of these sort of strategies of the people themselves. On the ship, what was interesting, there was a lot of tension between these Korean, these officers who were trained in the military, so they expected a certain kind of hierarchy, and the Filipinos who were, coming from this. So there was a lot of, the labor relations were really pretty harsh in the way they were treated. But what happened is when they got into port, the lower level guys could speak English much better, and they would have to communicate with the shore, with the guys on shore. And so what they would simply do is withdraw their participation from the Korean. And so the guy who was the first officer, who was in charge, who was the disciplinarian and would treat these guys pretty harshly, had his language skills were the poorest. And so then when he'd have to communicate, they would watch him fumble, and he knew all the technical stuff but couldn't communicate, and they would simply just withdraw participation and pretend they didn't understand, right? And so we were boarded by the Coast Guard, and they have to do a safety check, and they would ask the guy directly because he's supposed to be able to handle, emergency calls or anything. And Filipino guys understood everything that was going on, but would just say, "I don't understand," because the Korean officer was really going to lean on them to help him out to get past the safety inspection. And all of a sudden, they were saying exactly what he had been saying about that they're dumb or something like that, and they did that. So I think there's definitely that kind of strategy. But again, what I see is it tends to, in this case, in terms of thinking about it, reinforce the difference between the groups rather than sort of transcend it. It was definitely resistance, partly in reaction to being treated really harshly. You wouldn't expect them to sort of be helping him out in that case. But it definitely came out in sort of the way that, at least in that instance, of taking on the attributes that they were being constantly bombarded with. All right. No other questions? All right.
Okay. Let's thank Steve again.